Thank you very much to both of you for being here today. First, I'm looking very much forward to our discussion. We'll talk about AI, arts, and decolonisation, and particularly explore the intersections between art and artificial intelligence in education, both higher education and beyond. So this is actually the first in our podcast series on AI, arts, and decolonial futures. And we are building on our June symposium, which built particularly on our exhibition at King's and our work with both AI, art, and decolonisation, and specifically here in the podcast series, focusing on artificial intelligence rather than art alone. We would like to go sort of beyond the very dichotomous often narratives of AI as either this doom or great savior, and try and discuss how AI can both reinforce colonial discourses and narratives, but it can certainly also be used creatively different ways, although of course there are always pitfalls in that regard. So stay tuned for a rich discussion. The podcast is organized by our collective, our decolonial collective, Comfortably Uncomfortable, which gathers students and staff from King's and beyond to discuss and disseminate methods for decolonization. In addition to our podcast, we also have a blog, and you can contribute to that. Precise instructions are available at our website on.comfortablewordpress.com. We've even put a series of guidelines there. It's a space where we're really open to contributions in many different forms of expression. I'm working particularly on this because I have for some time worked, as I was just talking with you, Ari, about, particularly on memes and discourse, and particularly online in the context of police violence in Brazil. Just came out with my latest article on satirical memes. So please go and check that out if you have time. And I'm very interested to talk. I was looking into your most recent articles, and I realized that there was a lot missing in my article. But hopefully I can add some of your thoughts on these issues in my next article, because I thought there was a lot of interesting stuff going on. So I'm looking very much forward to our discussion. To introduce you guys more in detail, Dr. Belinda MacGill is a senior lecturer at the University of South Australia, renowned for her contributions to the decolonisation of art and design education, particularly emphasizing standpoint theory, embodied learning, and critical visual methodologies, and creative body-based learning, or CBL, and how that can empower students to engage in deep listening, dialogic meaning making, and fostering pluralist worldviews. And you have developed that, including particularly in your most recent paper, Decolonizing Art and Design Education through Standpoint Theory, Embodied Learning, and Deep Listening. You also have a project using virtual reality, which I'm very much looking forward to discussing. Dr. Ari Chand is a lecturer in education at the University of South Australia, also specializing in education theory, philosophy, and the ethical implications, in plural, I should say, of technological advancements in education. So his interdisciplinary research encompasses the impacts of artificial intelligence, digital technologies, and decolonization on pedagogical practices, particularly how AI can be used to challenge dominant power structures and promote diversity in education. And also particularly develop, and that would be great to, I think, look into, particularly perhaps from the Australian context specifically, to look into a question of culturally responsive pedagogies, inclusive of marginalized voices. So, Dr. MacGill, so your work consistently emphasizes the need to disrupt colonial narratives in art education. Could you elaborate on how embodied learning and deep listening contribute to decolonizing art education?
I take the reparative model of education in a way that's framed up within a culturally responsive approach in part, but as you know, that in the arts and similarly in the intersection between arts, AI, and decolonisation, it's a disorientating dilemma. So in arts and creative practice, we're often engaging in these encounters So in a way, it's now we're in this state of stumbling offline. So how do we reorientate ourselves towards understanding and recontextualizing these disorientating dilemmas? I know Ari's going to be talking about ethics and representation later, but in the context that I work primarily with pre-service teachers in Australia that will be arts educators going into early childhood, primary or secondary education. So what is the task and what is the ways in which we can use and centre understandings around these complex disorientating dilemmas towards a sensibility? Within that art sensibility, how do you produce a way in which you can reread the world relationally rather than through the lens in which Western art education practices have been embedded, which is generally through the eye and individualism, such as portrait drawing. Draw a portrait of yourself. This often happens. It's part of the curriculum that teaches us to think individually rather than relationally. So how do you craft creative curriculum design to ensure that students and pre-service teachers start to think relationally in the world that's local and specific? And I know Ari will also be talking about that concept. But in the process of deconstructing race files, gender files, those that are embodied in the cells and the minds of the students that we work with, as we are all on a continuum, myself included, how do we move and shift those standpoints? And I argue that it is a process of unlearning, and the strategies that I use come from drama-based instruction. And in those strategies, we use a lot of reflection practices and dialogic meaning making. So I won't go into the strategies, but I can share that website with you. You can literally lift those strategies and start creating your own site-specific, local and contextual approach to decolonising your curriculum. I'm certainly not declaring to have answers. I'm talking about process and meaning making, and you making it into your own. That it's a egalitarian in the sense that you can actually design it yourself, but follow the strategies that produce this work. And of course, this work comes from Freire and Weil, the pedagogy of the oppressed. So the kind of the lineage of this work does come from education and drama. Its purpose is to unpack and to ensure that whilst we go through this continuum and changing, shifting and in terms of our own standpoints, we also do it within a pedagogy of care. Because if we don't have care and relationality, then we are just being dictators.
Thank you very much. So I think there's a lot of very interesting stuff going on here. I was wondering, this website of yours, would it be possible for you to share?
Oh, sure. No problem. I'll do that right now.
Could you give a very specific example of how you have used art, particularly outside of higher education, right? Which I think sometimes it seems to me, but it may just, of course, be the fact that I'm in higher education. But it sometimes seems to me that decolonization is a little bit isolated or confined to higher education. And I wonder if it's not a bit late to start introducing people to decolonization, right? To start decolonizing people's way of thinking when people are already, studying anthropology or management or political science or medicine, et cetera, et cetera.
Well, I think, the knowledges that are produced through curriculum and education happens through schooling and society in general. The case example would be, we've been working with a school in one of the lowest socioeconomic areas in South Australia, and also is super diverse. So there is, in that super diversity and in the context of working in this environment, students are often in a site of struggle and trauma. So we use embodied strategies, and I'll show you that website, which I've got up at the moment, a consistent and ritual practice of using dialogue and within a pedagogy of care. So over the years, from early primary to they finish primary school, they actually become leaders in drama-based instruction strategies, which we call creative and body-based learning in South Australia. This work had been developed by Katie Dawson in collaboration with others and is used in schooling in the States and different parts of the world. So the teachers have training in it, the principal advocates for it, and it becomes a way in which they do teaching and learning math, science, English, and essentially it was what I was referring to in terms of relational thinking and using a lot of reflective practice. So in the reflective practice, which we use describe, analyse, relate, you actually go through that process of re-embodying new knowledge. So what's happened, I find now in education, is there's an absence of reflection and knowledge is not embodied. Similarly with AI, there's a complete absence of making and responding. The responding is the absent part, which means that no embodiment of new knowledge. So you're just plugging something into ChatGPT, for example, and it reproduces itself in a particular way without the embodiment of new knowledge. So it de-emphasizes the learning process.
Yeah, I think that's interesting on two things I think that can be taken there that I'd like to maybe pick up on there. One thing is what you say about sort of the interface between being the human and the artificial intelligence. And there are some people saying today, right, that actually what you see and that might be the reason for why sometimes you have some strange responses. I actually had a response from AI about a year ago to a very sort of minor request, which sounded like, I mean, it was just complete sort of like, it was literally insane. It sounded literally like someone who was completely detached from reality, just coming up with random words that made absolutely no sense. And some people are saying that has something to do with that it's AI is actually just responding to AI sometimes, and then you have this sort of almost degenerative kind of autophagy. But I would like to pick up also on one thing that you mentioned, which is teaching before higher education, teaching maths and decolonizing math teaching, right? Because there's sometimes people opine or put this counter argument to decolonization that, well, we can't decolonize medicine or exact sciences, right? Mm-hmm. But you mentioned here decolonizing math. So I'm interested in maybe if you could expand a little bit on that, how that might be possible.
Again, I'm not claiming to have answers here or making broad claims, but the process is actually we use our bodies in the learning of maths. So in primary school, we might do a role play about a plumber that's got to come and do some plumbing and a carpenter that's got to go and fix a certain amount of square meterage in a house. So we actually all become tiles, or we become things that are our material objects that then we learn to recreate how you could calculate things. So it's the epistemological and ontological ways of learning and teaching shift through an embodied way of learning and teaching. So that means that there's a shift in the processes in the brain that opens up and makes you unclosed, as comprised talks about, towards a new way of seeing the world. And again, these are just general comments. I'm not claiming to be an expert, but it's just a new way of addressing the disorientating dilemmas of education in a way we're stumbling offline and come up with new creative ways to do and think through teaching and learning rather than the very prescriptive, didactic, teacher-centred learning strategies. So there is a shift epistemologically and ontologically towards another way and a new encounter that offers a rethinking that's produced from the students as well. So it's co-designing with students to come up with a new learning design that actually matches that, the context. And it's all context, it's all specific, it's very highly considered. It's not just random. Learning design is very considered.
Brilliant. And so when this is sort of specific to students, how is that specific also to the Australian context that you work in? Could you expand a little bit on that?
Generally, because if this is going to go into a general conversation, I'll definitely pass that on to Ari.
Okay.
Thanks for having me on, Christopher. I am sort of more going to talk about the idea of So the context in which I am working is within illustration and animation and sort of cultural production more broadly. So I'm a lecturer in illustration and animation. Our students basically do this process of translating embodied knowledge and embodied learning in the way that they kind of experience the world around them immediately and then translate that through drawing or digital painting or some sort of material practice in which they're taking the actual observations of the real world and translating it into things that go into the input of AI, right? So, things like illustrations, things like animation, things that are created that are personal, individualized, embodied understandings of a creative practitioner's view of the world, an individual view of the world, and much similarly to the way that a small child or a teenager might be navigating their sort of psychosocial development through creative practice or art making or through dance or through music. We've got this sort of strange problem now where we're responding to the cultural production and generating sort of the middle or the center of content that's created online. So if an AI is generating an image or it's generating a text, it's really finding the kind of the path of least resistance, the center, the thing in the middle. It's not creating. It's creating sort of what it would be like to be a human versus an individual context of being in South Australia or being in New South Wales in Australia or being in Northern Queensland in Australia. They're all quite different places with different experiences of weather, of learning, of cultural expression. The idea of regional spaces is completely lost, I guess, once we start to have AI responding to the world. Really, it is doing what you were saying, which is kind of incestuous. It's kind of, responding to its own things now, as you're sort of indicating. So I think the idea of regionality is really important in the discussion of AI, especially within creative practice or art making. And just to put it in context, one of the interesting things that we were talking about, Belinda and I, was the idea that there's 8.4 billion people on the planet, but only really 5.3 of them are online. So what does that even do for contexts and regions in around the world, or particularly different regions in Australia who might not be engaging in online practices? How are they kind of, experiencing their local place? Are they ethically being represented online, perhaps? There's just kind of this real problem around the ethics of, I guess, representing locations, regions, places. And that's the conversation we're having with creative students who are going to go on to make content. If AI is just making content, is it just responding to everything that's online, or is it actually doing something, creating a children's book perhaps that's about South Australia and local animals that only exist here? Or is it just creating this kind of every character, every bear, everything that we're engaging with its content into the future? I'm not sure if that kind of helps kind of frame where I'm coming from.
Yeah, I think it does. It's not entirely new to AI in a way, right? I see you describing here, right? Because in a sense, this abstract individual, right, and particularly the abstract individual as neutral and particularly as white, I think this sort of idea that you have an abstract universal individual human that has to some degree historically been presented as being white. I think that's quite interesting if that is partly what is happening with these algorithms that don't necessarily take into account regional differences in people's experiences. Does that make sense to you, that this is in a way a reproduction of partly some older processes in that sense?
Yep. And I think it's, this conversation's already been happening within cultural production in general, right? You have things like Hollywood and children's book illustrators and educational material really having a challenged discussion about the sort of hegemonic or the dominant imagery, dominant cultural production, things that have been made in the past in sort of, I guess, perpetuating that notion that you're talking about. And there is sort of this conversation happening in the last 10 to 15 years about changing, people actively reflecting on that process of what's representation looks like in the things that we consume or the things that we're looking at, the things that we make as well, particularly in areas like, game design, even in writing. There's lots of conversations about the importance of the nuanced human experience, like location, different perspectives, and diversity ultimately. And, I think that's happening. And then it's happening at the same time in which AI is just kind of creating the middle for us to find. So, yeah, I'm not sure if you wanted to add to that, Belinda.
I think, we had that discussion about reframing the digital gaze as a hybrid product of human AI collaboration. So there's this slippage between what constitutes, on one hand, ethics of representation that we also discussed, but also the blurring of authorship and the ways in which that challenges the gaze, and that stumbling offline, the destabilisation of the artistic authorship. So in what way does that actually reproduce something new? And where are the lines in the sand? And again, we're all stumbling offline. It's not singular. So I think Ari was talking about the challenge of this shift in conversation and how that human-centric creative process is being unhinged to a degree, and where are the bits that we are going to actually meet somewhere to the processes of a hybrid product of human AI collaboration in a way that does work, and those that are highly dangerous and problematic, which is in the continual problems of the ethics of representation around stereotypes and reproducing what's already been produced, as Hall talks about in the circuit of culture and representation. But I don't know if you wanted to talk more about that, Ari, around that human-centric creative process and the singularity of artistic authorship and those shifts.
Yes, I mean, the conversation is also kind of quite separate to the ethics of stealing people's work and then AI kind of reproducing the idea of human authorship or the things that are made by. That's kind of a separate discussion, I think, as to the idea of what ethics mean in terms of our experience and the gaze of what we're kind of looking at. So we have kind of two different conversations. I mean, there's lots of different lobbying bodies that lobby about, the stealing artists' work and, reproducing things from a sort of placeless, stolen, non-contextual time in which artists make things like Midjourney and DALL-E and those sorts of programs. But I think the conversation around, the way that it reproduces the center and it doesn't take into consideration the individual experience, like, going down, if you're walking down the street and you're looking at a particular bird and you're going to incorporate that into an illustration that you do, it's very, if you were to do a story and then ask an illustrator from a different country to try and talk about that place, they can't do that. So how could AI do that either? This idea that place and regionality is really important to the way that culture is kind of perpetuated. Otherwise, we just get this flatlining and the middling out of everything. And it kind of, it perpetuates that hegemonic sort of dominant discourse of dominant narratives. And is AI even able to really unpack that? I mean, I'd question whether it can at all in a self-reflective way, like is happening within the way that we're either doing it in higher education or we're doing it in schools or we're looking at, it within cultural industries as well and creative industries.
Erases that flavour of sensibility produced by the local and specific experience.
Yeah. On that note, can I ask then a follow-up question, which is perhaps also a little bit pessimistic? But I worked with students on producing memes, and the idea being a little bit similar to what I hear you're doing, Ari, trying to sort of feed something different narratives, different visual depictions feed it into the algorithm in a way, right? So that the algorithm in theory would, change. But my problem with that is that, okay, beyond, of course, I think it has value in that it empowers students to be able to sort of both work in an embodied way and question this idea of the all-powerful algorithm, et cetera, et cetera. At the same time, algorithms are, and I'm not a mathematician and I don't understand very well how algorithms work, but I think I understand on the very basic level, algorithms work based on a likelihood, right? They have a lot of data and then they essentially calculate, right, the likelihood of something. And feeding minority experiences, right, into a mathematical algorithm that is equipped or that is coded to look at likelihood, right? How can that change the algorithm?
I mean, again, I'll claim not to be an expert in these areas either, but in terms of the actual machine learning of things and the way that they're set up. But there is something to be said about these systems are also wrapped up into sort of some technological utopianism in which, there's a determinism about the way that they're used and, there's a dominance in the way that they're used. For example, even with using artificial intelligence, now there's a paywall. So in terms of the social reproduction of things, you might not even be able to actually use it to do what you're saying. So it's already cutting people out of the picture who can't maybe afford it. There's a classism that's involved in that process of I can't actually afford to pay for OpenAI and ChatGPT 5, I can only get the baseline model, which sort of is wrapped up in that sort of Silicon Valley-esque approach to the way that these things have been platformed and built in the first place, in terms of what they allow, what they access, who they privilege and the voices that are either developing them and or, the data sets of the individual experience, like you're saying, minorities globally, wherever that may be, who are not producing their own content about their particular place and that being able to cut through. I mean, the same sort of thing is happening within the music industry as well and has been for some time with things like Spotify where, local music is not cutting through these algorithms the way that TikTok is pushing people, certain imagery towards people is always manipulated. So I understand what you're saying about the fact that it does depend on what you prompt it with, what you ask it to do, and maybe the systems that it, preferences. But does it have the nuance to be able to even recognize that? I don't know if it does.
Absolutely. I think it's crucial perhaps to keep in mind, because I guess my question sort of was a bit loaded and also, I think, perhaps gave a little bit, fetishized the algorithm a little bit, right? And I think that's something that's important to keep in mind that we shouldn't do, right? Because, of course, there are, political choices and of course, business choices, as you mentioned, right, that are behind how the algorithms are set up. And also simply, sometimes just filters, including paywalls, right, that keep people out or keep people's experiences out, et cetera, et cetera. So I think that's very relevant. I think an example that was in the news recently here in the UK in terms of sort of some of these filters that are political also was the question of what was the answer that ChatGPT would give you if you put in the question whether or not Palestinians deserved freedom and liberty, right? And it was very different and sort of convoluted and full of these conditionalities and very different from what it answered if you asked it whether or not other groups of people deserved freedom and liberty, right? So I think that's really important to keep in mind that there are artificial intelligence. It's not just artificial, right? In that sense, there are these filters, et cetera, et cetera.
Just on that as well, I think on a more meta-analysis, the ways in which coding developed and the inception of programming, there was the original premise that it builds on the ways in which children learn. So they did use some theoretical framings around children's learning as this exponential process of learning. So that is which children were they referring to? What contextual knowledges were they using? So going back to that root inception of the ways in which programming and mathematical theory by Shannon was developed and used is an interesting kind of relook at the actual ways in which it operates.
That's quite interesting and fascinating in a way. I guess, again, what we come back to is that children learn also, well, both in very different ways, but certainly in a way that is, if you've ever worked with children, that is very embodied, right? But if you've ever worked with children, as I have, if you have had children by yourself, that's, of course, one of the things that AI lacks. I heard recently there's a French artist who works on making sort of baby robots, so an attempt at actually having an embodied experience. But I guess, again, it's who is making these robots, right? Where does the input come from? Where do they learn from? And I guess there's also sort of a question when we think about AI and this idea that AI is conscious seems to make absolutely no sense to me. There's a question of this, everything is sort of given at the same time with AI, it seems to me, right? And if we think about someone like Bergson and his thoughts about consciousness, it's based upon the idea that we live in time, right? We are beings that are, steeped in time, steeped in both our own histories and those of others, and how we experience our own histories and remember our own histories and remember those of people around us, et cetera, but perhaps also people that we learn about through technologies while reading or while experiencing art, including art that is produced in one way or another, or that is communicated in one way or another via AI. So I was wondering if you want to comment on that, both the potential of AI to communicate across time and across space, but also sort of how this aspect of time, how the specifically human and comes into can perhaps be a protection against some of the dangers of AI, the way that human beings, that we are steeped in time.
Yeah. I don't have an answer to that, but I think it's like, how do we narrow down the question? So the encounter and the spatio-temporal relationship within the modes of communication and the interactions that we're choosing to have is local and specific again. So that being an example of how do we narrow that back down to what is the question that we're asking? Why have we stumbled offline? Why are we having this encounter in a particular way? And where does the question of ethics sit? And how can we navigate that ethics? And what can it produce that is useful? So it's not amorphous. It's not godlike. It's not, however you want to define that. It is a relational opportunity that does not necessarily have a teleological outcome.
Yeah, and it's actually quite interesting what you're saying, Christoffer, about robots, because ultimately that is interesting. The idea that there would need to be some sort of technological embodiment that at least mimics and sort of like kind of anthropomorphizes like what Belinda's saying, that it can't actually have those. But for some reason, when we associate those things, we make AI in sentience, intelligence, and the idea of embodied robots a really closely linked thing, because sort of it is kind of like non-godlike. Belinda's sort of mentioning that, there's a process of trying to make it more human than our, so that does mimic some of our learning, some of our actual, experiences of moving through the world, and our problem with time. So
I guess from the perspective of working particularly with indigenous groups, I was wondering if there's something to be then, if there's any inspiration there to take from the way that indigenous groups are often particularly closely attached to their local histories, right? And how that perhaps also in a way contrasts to some of those, universal and these Silicon Valley utopias or dystopias, we should perhaps say, where, of these this got enormous power and just destroying everything, right? Destroying the path to move, to these dystopias or utopias. Is there something specific there to be learned, particularly from Indigenous groups?
I won't speak for Indigenous groups generally, but I will give an example about the interesting component of materiality and how that is the third or the syntactic interface between the human and AI. And as I mentioned around the inception of programming around child development, that was a Western child development. And the materiality is, how do you hold a pen and how do you start drawing in early childhood? And it's when you start drawing in particular stages, it gives evidence that you're having this progression. Whereas as a teacher in Armata, in a remote Aboriginal community in Central Desert, what I noticed was that 2-year-olds were doing large circles in the sand and demonstrating shape, sound and colour and connection to colour, because colour was taught early, as a completely different, I wouldn't say completely different, it was another form of development that was done differently. So the universality around child development, for example, that is centred around the pen towards writing, it stands in contrast to embodied practices of drawing and working in sand and learning through aunties in a community model. So those two things highlight, not speaking for Aboriginal people, but just in terms of disrupting the concept of universality and the ways in which these past representations continue to feed our questioning around the problem, which goes back to Ari's point around the ethics as well as the ways in which we engage in conversation around what rocks are we unturning to try and work out what is the problem.
And quite interesting. And it also, I think, teaches us to some degree, right, that, of course, technology has always been with us, right? And differences in terms of the kinds of technology different human groups use have also always been with us, and how it influences the way that we interact, obviously, with the environment, our environment, and with ourselves. It's not something completely new with AI, right? So I think that's, yeah. Do you want to add something to that?
No, other than just perhaps, the materiality thing is quite interesting. The idea of sort of tools and, mediating one's experience, especially when it comes to creative practice, or, how young children do it, or how we do it at different stages of development, as Belinda sort of said. And the idea that, are people doing material, are they doing that type of thing within their experience these days, or is it all just, this idea of disembodiment on the online space, or in a space in which AI works or manipulates our experience, that sort of socio-technological determinism? How much is the machine or the internet, this sort of placeless, timeless space, affecting our behavior now? If you're wearing an Apple Watch, is it dictating when you're actually waking up, or is your body? This kind of notion of the placeless, timeless space that Belinda sort of mentioned, we might stumble out of, is like, how much is that involved in our experience now? And then when it comes to creative practice, how much does that kind of influence the way that we see the world, or are shown things, or, actually learn about something when maybe we shouldn't learn something at that particular stage of our development too? What are the questions and ethics around seeing things and experiencing things, and, visuospatially, learning visuospatially, but then this idea that this tablet or this, image is disrupting that process by showing us certain things that or at different stages of life affect the way that we learn and the way that we actually experience the world now.
Yeah, I've heard from parents, right, who say that when their children pick up a book or magazine, rather than trying to flip the pages, they will, do the iPad, sort of like try and see if they can get to the next page by touching the So I think that's an example perhaps of what you're saying.
I actually, just as an anecdote, I actually was teaching in a drawing class and saw a student do this, where we were making them draw physically for the first 3 weeks of their drawing class, and they weren't allowed to use an iPad and an Apple Pencil until the fifth week. And the student actually tried to click onto the piece of paper in order to undo something. And I think I just had one of those moments where I was like, this is just a really surreal problem, that we've now so attached to our digital experiences and the way that we navigate things that we are actually maybe forgetting that process. It's fascinating.
Yeah, it is. Can I ask how old was that student?
This student was 21, 20 in their first year of university.
Okay, okay, I see. Okay, yeah. Oh,
and if you think about the timeline of that makes sense, right? Because that student will have lived since the inception of iPhone and an iPad as their general experience, and the way that they would develop visuospatially, across their life. That's kind of where we're hitting now. We are hitting the iPad generation, or that has had that experience of navigating the world as a sort of cyborg, having something like this completely attached to you, and digital detox is such a big part of that process now. It's what people are talking about.
Yeah, I heard this comedian the other day saying that all this focus on mindfulness today, it didn't exist like 20 years ago, because, we would just be mindful when we were in a queue, right? Or when we were, if I may go there, when we were on the loo, we would just be there, right? Rather than being on our phones, scrolling, right? I found that to be an interesting reflection. Today, mindfulness is this massive industry, right? And really, it's just sort of being there, right? Rather than being on your phone.
Yeah, and actually in South Australia and across Australia, that process is being applied to schooling, so that actually phones in classrooms are not being used anymore in order to try and enhance that learning. That's a very recent development, I guess, here, where people are trying to disrupt that process and make people actually, not be attached to their phone. So I think that's quite interesting.
This was, I would say, really a very interesting discussion. So I want to thank you very, very much. Thank you very much to both of you. If you have anything sort of final that you would like to say, then we can take a couple more minutes for that.
Just what blindnesses are being reproduced or produced as a result of these intersections? That was just a final comment or question.
I think that's a good place to sort of to continue a reflection. Absolutely.